Good afternoon and welcome to a joint webinar with CIEEM, BREEAM and the Landscape Institute. This webinar will focus on developing the ecological assessment, the how, the why and your opportunity to help shape the content. Before we officially begin, we have a few announcements to make whilst attendees join the webinar. So CIEEM's autumn conference on mitigation, monitoring and effectiveness is fast approaching and we have limited spaces available on our workshops. Further information on the programme and how to book can be found using the bottom link. Please note that bookings will close on the 16th of November. CIEEM also offers a wide range of training courses from beginner to advanced levels. Here are some of our upcoming courses which focus on developing skills in appropriate assessment, habitat management for beginners, habitat regulation appraisal, and introduction to protected species law and policy. Further information and courses can be found on the training and events area of our website. Finally, CIEEM will also be hosting another webinar called CIEEM and Brexit, Achieving a Better Future. This webinar will cover the basic background to the EU referendum with regards to the natural environment, the current situation and potential implications for the sector across the UK and Ireland. There will also be a Q&A at the end of the session. Please join us on Thursday the 9th of November at 1 PM to find out more. To register, please search for webinars on our training and events section on the website. So it looks like the numbers have stabilised and everybody seems to have joined the webinar. It's important to note that this webinar provides an important opportunity to influence a significant development in our ecology. It's great that you've all joined us today and please do feedback by responding to the consultation. There will be two occasions to ask questions during this webinar. The first opportunity will be in the middle of the presentation and these questions should be aimed about the BREEAM family and specific questions regarding the consultation process. There will also be time at the end of the webinar for questions relating to the new approach for ecology with BREEAM. If you would like to ask questions, there is an option at the top right of your screen labelled Q&A. Click on this and enter your question and press send and we will endeavour to answer all of your questions. One final note to make before we begin is that you can log this webinar under the following competencies using the online CPD. Using the online CPD tool. It counts towards your structured CPD and the relevant competencies are listed here. So it's development of strategic policies, plans, legislation or standards, and effective communication, negotiation and influencing. So without further ado, I will now pass you over to our presenters. These include Yetundi Abdul from BREEAM, Max Wade from CIEEM, and Mark Loxton from the Landscape Institute. Thank you very much, and over to you, Yetundi.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody joining the webinar today. As stated, my name is Yetundi Abdul and I work in the BREEAM team at BRE. I'm BREEAM's Scheme Development Manager and I'm going to be here, I guess, chairing the webinar today. But I'm not on my own. As stated, I've also got Max Wade here and also Mark Loxton with me, and I'll leave them to introduce themselves now.
I'm Max Wade. I'm a technical director at AECOM, and I've been involved in the ecology aspect of BREEAM for quite a number of years, including providing training through CIEEM, recently supporting BRE in developing the ecology assessment within the BREEAM process.
I'm Mark Loxton. I'm a director of the Adams-Loxton Partnership. We're both landscape architects and ecologists. and we've been in private practice for over 35 years.
Great. So just to give you an overview of what we're going to be going through here today, a lot of the beginning of the webinar will focus on an overview of BREEAM and what it is, the background behind the ecology section, and how it's evolved, and then move on to talk about the consultation process that we have ongoing at the moment and the development of the assessment criteria and how it's changed, as well as looking at the cross-sectorial approach, which is the key reason why we're hosting this webinar involving 3 organisations. Then we'll have a break in the middle for Q&A if there are any questions that anyone would like to ask. Clarifying questions is what we're expecting, but anything is fine. And then we'll go on to look at the ecology in context, applying the assessment criteria and what this means. And this is where Max and Mark will give you an overview of the realities of what this could mean, also thinking about the assessment criteria. Then there'll also be another opportunity to ask questions again, and then we'll close the webinar. So I'm going to get started on the BREEAM bit. So quite a few slides here giving you an overview of what BREEAM is. So it is the longest established and most widely used assessment method for buildings, master planning and infrastructure in the world. Launched back in 1990. It started off with the home scheme, offices, industrial, and has grown since then. It is about going through a process, but it is focused on outcomes. So looking at the real benefit that exists there, not just for the built environment, but also for people at the end of the process. So a lot of its outcomes are evidence-based, and as we talk about ecology here today, we'll mention some of the areas, how that's reflected within that category of BREEAM. And we like to think as well that it drives innovations. It is all about going beyond the regulatory minimum, aiming very much for good best practice, exceeding that in some cases as well. But saying all of this, it is actually a voluntary method. Although it's specified by organisations and governments, they don't have to. And so we very much work to promote the benefits of BREEAM and also drive industry sectors, etc., in going beyond what they think might be possible. So it's become quite an established label, showcasing corporate social responsibility, but in effect environmental sustainability performance. And over time, it has grown to become a family of schemes covering the built environment life cycle stages, which I'll talk about a little bit in a moment. But you can see there from under this BREEAM family of schemes, now thinking about new build homes, we have the Home Quality Mark, which is our answer to the Code for Sustainable Homes, and CIEEM as well, recently acquired by BRE, which is now also part of the BREEAM family, covering infrastructure. So I mentioned that BREEAM started in 1990, but since then it has grown significantly to cover quite a substantial part of the world. So the slide you see in front of you shows where BREEAM has been used. So where what we call registered assessments are in place, and therefore assessments have either taken place or in the process of taking place. So it's quite exciting for us to see the world going green, if you like, the BREEAM green, and we'd hope that that would increase over time, and we might even cover the entire world. You'll see that there's some darker areas on the map covering the UK, bits of Scandinavia, if I can say that, Spain and Germany, and there are probably smaller bits there that you can't quite make out from this map, but those represent what we call our national scheme operators, and that's where BREEAM has been adopted either by part of a country, a region, or by the whole country as that country's national method. So obviously that is the case for the UK, but other countries you can see there as well. So again, that's quite exciting for us, for BREEAM to be considered in such a way that it's being adopted by countries, regions, etc. as their national method. So although our focus here today is ecology, it seemed important to point out that BREEAM is a holistic method and covers a whole range of issues throughout the built environment relating to construction. So energy, water and waste are ones which tend to come up a lot, but a whole range of other issues are equally as important, such as health and well-being, waste, transport, pollution management, etc. And as we evolve and develop our schemes, these continue to grow and be shaped. So this represents the core of what we tend to look at, but in other schemes such as our master planning scheme, BREEAM Communities, and the infrastructure scheme as well, through CIEEM, these categories or core areas are titled slightly differently. But this emphasises the fact that it is all about thinking about all of the impacts of the built environment, looking at what we can do to mitigate those impacts, benefit society, and also think very much about economic prosperity. So our overarching aim in BREEAM is to assess, reward and encourage environmental, social and economic sustainability throughout the built environment. And there were 3 key areas that we felt really reflected this. So looking at encouraging continuous performance and improvement and innovation by setting a broad range of scientifically rigorous requirements that go beyond current regulations and best practice. So very much when thinking about the ecology section, thinking about any of those other sections, it's always going above and beyond the regulatory minimum, and very much, where possible, encouraging and promoting innovation. But it is all very well talking about science and benchmarks and going beyond current regulations. But if we don't then think about who actually is using the method, as I mentioned, BREEAM is a voluntary method, then we might fail before we even get started. So it is all about empowering those who own, commission, deliver and manage buildings, infrastructure, communities to achieve their sustainability aspirations. So you could say that in some ways this webinar is a part of that. It's helping to get the message out there, giving you the opportunity to learn more about what we're doing, working with different organisations, but then also asking you to get involved yourself and tell us what you think of what we're proposing and what potentially you might well have to live with within our BREEAM schemes, at least for a defined period of time. And then through our schemes, it's also building confidence by providing independent certification that gives value and wider benefits to individuals, businesses, society and the environment. Through what we're aiming to do, I think is quite clear. So when I talk about built environment life cycle stages, what do I mean? I mentioned our community scheme, which covers master planning, and I mentioned CIEEM, which covers infrastructure. But then within buildings, we have schemes that cover new construction, refurbishment and in use, non-domestic and domestic. And so you can see at the bottom there, really trying to cover that full environment, built environment life cycle suite at the bottom, through to end of life. We don't yet have a scheme for deconstruction or demolition in the UK, but that's potentially something which we may do in the future, depending on the call for that. So I've been working at BREEAM, it'll be 13 years early next year. Over that time, I've seen BREEAM evolve and change to quite a small methodology, if you like, to what is now this world-leading methodology used in so many different countries and quite strongly in the UK. But with all of that, ecology has always been quite a strong part of BREEAM. It was added in 1993 and has evolved with aims and issues, but the content has remained broadly consistent since 1998. So I'm sure Max could say a lot more than I could about ecology and BREEAM in terms of the detail there, but roughly over the last 20 years, it's remained broadly the same. But with that, it's always had the aim of identifying ecologically valuable features and opportunities geared towards protecting and enhancing habitats and mitigating unavoidable impacts. So really very much about promoting ecology, maintaining it, and where possible, enhancing it. A strong part of that has been about long-term ecological management practices and strategies for assessed sites and associated areas as well. So that's where we have been with ecology in BREEAM and the past 20 years. So a very brief overview, but things change. we move on. It's been 20 years. So now, in a whole range of areas, we're looking at how BREEAM develops and evolves. We always have done, but very much so, again, looking at this for ecology. And this has been reflected through the development of BREEAM's UK's strategic ecology framework. So the framework itself very much is an innovative piece of work for us. It was a response partly to changes in best practice and policy, but also very much to feedback we'd received over the years on the ecology category in BREEAM. Again, I'm sure Max can say more about the type of feedback given to BRA in the past about ecology, and I'm sure many of you listening as well will remember some of the things you would have fed back to us or fed back to each other about the methodology. So we've listened very much to that, and our response has been this ecology framework. So it was partly published to enable those working in the built environment to better understand the basis of BREEAM evaluations and take account of this in future planning. But also for us internally, it sets a common basis against which we will be looking to update and develop the ecology criteria in BREEAM moving forward across those life cycle stages. So what we wanted to try and ensure is that it represented a fair and balanced framework for evaluating ecological impacts and mitigation issues across the BREEAM family of schemes, which you'll see again shortly. So we have this overarching strategic ecology framework. The schemes that, or at least the life cycle stages that BREEAM covers, which I showed you earlier on, which actually represents 7 schemes for us in the UK, and I'll go on to tell you the names of each one shortly. And then it's looking at how we translate that framework into the scheme criteria as appropriate for that life cycle stage and that scheme type. And that's very much what we are in the process of doing now, working with CIEEM and also the Landscape Institute to do that. So again, some of you might already be aware through communications from CIEEM about that scheme development work, thinking about where we were in 1998, applying the strategic ecology framework to the BREEAM schemes, and then updating that criteria, taking us in potentially a different direction, the same direction we're still in the middle of finding out. So we began implementing the SEF, so the Strategic Ecology Framework, in 2016, and it covers all of the BREEAM schemes used in the UK, and those are listed there. So both domestic and non-domestic, new construction and refurbishment covered as well. Now, thinking about all of those schemes, life cycle stages, master planning is very different in its own way from domestic refurbishment, which is very different from buildings in operation and in use, and how you think about ecology in those contexts, which is very different from an infrastructure project, be it a road or a railway track, a bridge, etc. But considering all of that, there are key issues which connect all of them. And we've grouped these under 4 assessment issues as we structure information within the BREEAM assessment criteria. So first of all, identification and understanding the risks and opportunities for the project. Then managing negative impacts on habitats and biodiversity. Then from there, once you've done that, thinking about enhancement, and then going on to looking at the long-term management of and maintenance of biodiversity. So very much understanding what you've got, thinking about the impacts you're having, thinking about how you could make that site better, and then thinking about how you maintain those benefits and rewards over time, and where possible, even they become enhanced over time. So all of those schemes, in their own way, as appropriate to them, all aim to reflect these 4 issues, or address these 4 issues. And I've put a note there about the consultation. So what I've got here is a consultation document that you can see on the right-hand side. It's out for consultation now, So we're very much hoping that as part of this webinar, we can encourage a lot of you to go and have a look at the consultation document and feedback to us. I will say this again towards the end of the webinar, but this is your chance. After this time, I'm not saying that we won't change the criteria again for another 20 years, but this has been a mammoth effort in its own way. And we very much want to include as many of you as possible, so you have your say as we start to set the criteria for schemes for the next 3 or 4 years as part of the development process. So please do get involved and give us your feedback by going to the link on this page below. So this just provides a little bit more information about the aim of each issue. So the first issue I talked about is looking at determining that ecological baseline and the zone of influence of the site. And then thinking about identifying the risks and opportunities for achieving optimum outcomes. So what can you do with that site? A shop fit out is very different from a full-blown major refurbishment. A university site is very different from an office block in London or in Glasgow or in Manchester. A floor refurbishment of a hospital is very different from a classroom refurbishment or an extension to existing school. So what exactly can you do with that site there in the first place? Then thinking about managing those impacts, and quite a lot of you will start to see the mitigation hierarchy come into play now, but looking at avoiding or limiting as far as possible negative impacts on habitat and biodiversity arising from activities on the site. So what can happen there, thinking about what type of site you've got. Then it's all about enhancement. Very much focused on the site initially and then within the zone of influence in support of local and regional priorities. And as I mentioned, with long-term management and maintenance biodiversity, securing that, ensuring that people are trained to allow it to actually happen, and then maintaining it over the life of that development, whatever that development might be, to ensure that those benefits are realised. So I mentioned that BREEAM looks at things holistically, but within different categories, there is a focus on the aim for that category, so a focus on ecology. So as part of the SEF development, what we've wanted to do is look at how we do that and evolve it or broaden it where necessary. So what we have done is think very much beyond ecology and think about the construction process, the built environment life cycle stage, operational buildings and think about how they link across to other sustainability related areas. So in implementing the SEF, we set up an advisory group, initially made up of ecology and landscape professionals, understanding that this is all about ecology, so ecologists are central to the process, but very much listening to feedback that we received from landscape architects over the years, as well as ecologists, that both disciplines need to be involved early on to support positive outcomes for ecology over the life of development. So the first stage was us all getting together in a room, talking about it and understanding what needed to be done, and inputting that into the development of the ecology assessment criteria, which is out for consultation. So you've seen this slide before. I think I might well have hammered this point home now. We're thinking very much about that holistic approach, but still that cross-sectorial approach, thinking about how we reflect this within the assessment criteria moving forward, and very much help other stakeholders other than ecologists and landscape landscape architects. So thinking very much about those involved in the process here. So contractors, developers, architects, clients, specifiers, etc. Understand that there are multiple benefits by thinking about ecology on a site and how it can fit into or interact with or is linked to construction in many different ways. as in some ways indicated on your slide. Health and well-being through noise mitigation, light pollution control measures, resilience, thinking about flood risk management, surface water runoff, climate sensitive urban design, other areas as well, thinking about the community's involvement, on life and life cycle costing, and landscape design is very much there alongside green infrastructure. So thinking very much about how we maximise and promote these opportunities. So all of that, still thinking about that with this consultation criteria, you can maybe start to get a sense that it's no easy task that we set ourselves. Working with CIEEM, the Landscape Institute, to come up with what we hoped was coherent and sensible for the long term. But we'll see, and I'm sure you'll tell us this as part of the your feedback in the consultation, on the consultation document. If you hopefully you'll go to the website and do that. So as part of this third stage, very much so, we had that focus with landscape architects and ecologists, but what we wanted them to do is think about everyone else involved in the process, and involve them in it as well, because it needs to work for all. BREEAM is a voluntary process, and what we want to do is ensure that ecology isn't an afterthought as part of the in the BREEAM process, but it's something that is actively pursued from the very outset. So thinking about practical application, those that are involved in the assessment process, so design team members, project team members, contractors, the BREEAM assessors, the BREEAM advisory professionals, etc., are important to get involved, facilities managers, but then also thinking about issues relating to monitoring, review, and handover considerations, as well, and how they're important in achieving a successful outcome. So many different things to think about. Lots of considerations to make. Lots of things that we had to be aware of, and who knows, hopefully we've got it right. For those of you that have had a lot of feedback on BREEAM over the years, it's your opportunity to help us understand what you think how well you think we've done this time round, and also for the advisory group as well, to get broader views from peers through CIEEM's membership, but also the Landscape Institute as well, if anybody is listening from that organisation as well. So this is your opportunity to ask questions, any clarifying questions at this stage. And if there aren't any, what I will do is hand over to Max and to Mark to take you through the next section of the webinar. And if you do have any questions on what I've said, then please do send them through, and we'll deal with them at the end. We have allowed quite a bit of time for Q&A at the end, because we want this as much as possible as well to be an interactive webinar and allow you to explore points with us. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Max and Mark to take you through this section on ecology and context, applying the assessment criteria.
So this is Max here. And first off, to say there's nothing really to substitute for reading through the ecology assessment issues document that Yetunde has just explained parts of, and to encourage you obviously to provide feedback on that. That contains a considerable amount of detail, and what Mark and I would like to do is just to focus on some of the key objectives that we've been working on with BRE to help them develop the ecology part of the BREEAM process. And these focus on the assessment being for ecology. Up till now, there's been something of a focus of just biodiversity, but there is considerable scope to broaden this, as we'll briefly explain. Also to enable ecology to be a flagship, an important part of the BREEAM process for the clients and other stakeholders as a real benefit. In order to do that, we need to be rewarding recommendations that are ecologically sound, and also recognising the role of the landscape architect at an early stage in the process, so that we can achieve an integrated outcome, something of a challenge up till now. Broader ecology enhancements also need rewarding, and this could lead to improving ecosystem services, for example. And then recognising that it isn't just the site that we need to pay attention to, but there are those other parts of the BREEAM process, particularly the zone of influence around the site, which could contain habitat in terms of connectivity, a watercourse, for example, and then beyond that, the local area where there may well be other schemes in operation, nature improvement areas, biodiversity action plans, and so on, that we can link into. So looking at those individually, first off, we've got that our assessment is for ecology, and we need at the outset to identify ecologically valuable features, including biodiversity, but also the way in which the site works, including water, soil, and so on. At that stage, also identifying opportunities to conserve and enhance the ecology, mitigating unavoidable impacts, and as Yetunde was emphasising, looking to the future to ensure long-term management. These aren't schemes that we wish to be just a flash in the pan. We need them to be sustained on into the future. So this could well involve identifying the site, as we do at present with the BREEAM process. What ecological value does it have? Looking at associated habitats, the watercourse, for example, what sort of condition is it in? And are there other habitats in the vicinity that we can bring into our thinking and an assessment process, for example, an isolated piece of woodland? The recommendations need to work in an ecological sense. They need to be appropriate and realistic when we're thinking about habitat creation. And we need to choose the right sort of species in order to assist the functioning of the ecosystem. This will be a blend of achieving biodiversity gain, but also maybe, for example, choosing the right sort of trees in order to achieve a benefit for air quality, or maximising sort of hydrological benefit of the planting that we're recommending. And again, recommendations for long-term management, usually within our landscape and habitat management plan. And these can be fairly simple ideas in terms of planting up and developing the riparian habitat, trees, and other appropriate vegetation. We could be looking to introduce a tree belt to join up some of the vegetation habitats, or if we've got the opportunity, particularly within urban areas, to introduce a green roof. So at this stage, at this early stage, we need to be involving the landscape architect. And I'll pass over to Mark to ask him to just run through some of the things that we need to think about at this sort of early stage in the process.
Thank you, Max. I think one of the things to make sure is that during the survey or the assessment of the site, that the ecological features are identified at an early stage, as Max has said, because often there can be slight conflicts between the aesthetic form and appearance that a client may want, but there also may be a need, as we've said, to establish ecological value on the site. And that will lead on to what type of vegetation would be most appropriate. And most critically of all this process is to think about the management of what we're creating, because if we create something that is unmanageable, then clearly that may have a long-term impact on whether the client is able to cope with that or not. So these things need to be discussed at an early stage. Here we see the development of the site that we've assessed, and as usual you get quite a lot of parking. The possibility of the green roof, planting maybe shrubs, trees, grass, and the opportunity to link into the surroundings, particularly here, maybe thinking about green infrastructure links. The tree belt might be quite an important thing, which links to the outside, the identification of the woodland earlier, and the planting, the presumably natural planting along the little stream, could all then be linked into the site that we're looking at. As we keep repeating ourselves, the early involvement of yourselves with ourselves, i.e. landscape architects and qualified ecologists, is very important, because I think clients need to be made aware of how the design is progressing and on what basis we are going to decide on the mitigation and proposals. And it's important that the ecology is integrated with the landscape design, so that at the end of the day we can produce a cohesive landscape and habitat management plan. It could be that not all of the site has native species. It could be that there's a combination of native and non-native, but as you are aware, even non-native can have substantial benefit. And coming back again to our management, the management of these areas is important. For example, with grass, it could be that the grass is only cut once a year. The grass could be cut twice a year, once a week, once a month. That will then have a very direct impact on the species that develop and their value. We come back to aesthetic form, and we need to address the aesthetics, because the owner or the users at the end of the day have to understand what it is we're trying to achieve. And as the landscape side of things, the landscape architect would be keen to make sure that the scheme has aesthetic appeal. It may be a housing estate that needs to be sold, and therefore we must be conscious of that aspect. But personally, I don't think it's possible. It is possible to integrate that approach with vegetation establishment, which has some benefit, and again, the maintenance.
So these ideas start to form the basis of looking at ecosystem services, ecosystem function, looking outside of our site to include the zone of influence. This is very much a feature of the new ecology within the BREEAM process, and looking for opportunities to enhance and improve these services. That necessitates linking in with other specialist consultants within the project, and these could be drainage engineers, air quality expert, people dealing with sort of other features. And one could look at a sort of a Venn diagram where these interlink. So you can see there ecology at the heart of what we're trying to do. But the drainage engineer, in terms of the water, is going to be important. That links into the functioning of the stream, or maybe the role of the green roof. And our tree belt, which, as Mark says, is going to be good for connectivity, but structured appropriately with the right sort of species, could well have a benefit from an air quality point of view, particularly if we're in an inner city location. And much of this could be utilised, as Mark says, looks attractive, encourages you to get out, and in certain circumstances encourages the residents or the users of the site to take exercise, get out there and enjoy using the facilities. So really an emphasis within the ecology part of the BREEAM process to think about these features, how they can be linked up, focusing in on the site that we've been looking at to bring out the restoration of the soil along the side of the river, the restoration of the river itself, introducing ecological connectivity using the tree belt, and water flow management from the green roof. Interspersed amongst that, a number of biodiversity gains, the BG you can see on the screen there. We can get considerable benefit across a number of functions within the ecosystem by this approach, and our recommendations would reflect that. And then lastly, just to emphasize within the identification of these ecosystem services, the importance of the zone of influence in the assessment. We need to think more widely, as we do when we're assessing a site, for example, in the preliminary ecological appraisal, looking outside of the site to see how it links into not only the zone of influence, but more widely into the local area. So finally, as Yetunde said, this is your opportunity to input into the process, into stage 3, as we call it, and to contribute to that. The assessment, ecological assessment consultation covers all of the UK BREEAM schemes. So from that point of view, it's really important. It marks a significant change in the way in which ecology is being dealt with within the BREEAM process, responding to the feedback that BR has. So that's important too. And as Yetunde said earlier, if we miss this opportunity, it will be a number of years down the line before we're able to help shape and form this new and important approach to bringing ecology into quite a lot of the work potentially that we do. And again, just to emphasize, consultation closes 6th of November.
So thank you for listening, and it's great we've started to have some questions coming through. So if I just read out the question, it's from Sam Luker, and Sam asks, could you further define the difference between improving the ecology and improving the biodiversity? So I think that's one for Max.
Certainly, thanks for your question, Sam. The two can be almost synonymous, but the idea within the BREEAM process, and it has been called land use and ecology, is to bring out more of the ecological functioning within a site. So going back to the example of the site that we've been looking at, to make recommendations that actually improves the way in which we manage the water, or the ecosystem deals with the water coming off and into the stream or into the drainage system, would be an improvement to the ecology of that part of the site, of the stream itself. But as part of that, we could include, well, almost as a given, there will be an improvement in the biodiversity of the stream. You would potentially be creating biodiversity on the green roof, which would be good maybe for pollinating insects. So there would be an improvement from a biodiversity point of view, but the site, in sort of maybe simple terms, would be healthier in terms of its ecological function. It would be working more in a more optimal way, more like it would have functioned had there not been a building, a car park, and various other aspects associated with it.
Okay, great. So we're starting to get the questions coming through, and thanks, Max. We're starting to get questions coming through, so I think we'll just work our way through them. So I'll just answer what seems to be a quick one from Tim Smith. Will these changes to BREEAM also affect the Code for Sustainable Home scheme? The answer to that is no. The Code for Sustainable Homes is a scheme which we maintain on behalf of the Department for Communities and Local Government, so for the government. So it would be up for them to decide whether there were any changes that would be made to that scheme. My understanding is that scheme is also being wound down. So in my opinion, it would be unlikely that there would be any further changes to that scheme. So these changes, I suppose it would be new, would be applicable for our answer to the code, if you like, BRE's answer to the code, which is the home quality mark. So within that scheme, the assessment criteria within the consultation document, once agreed, it will appear within that scheme. So there's another question here about BREEAM evaluations. I'm not entirely sure whether Mark or Max might want to answer this one, but it's from Greg Carlson. So again, great to see the questions coming through, and please do continue to send them through. But the question is, BREEAM evaluations are frequently required for T and C planning purposes. Not sure.
Town and country.
Town and country planning purposes. The zone of influence may well be outside the control of the applicant. To what extent are we expecting to be, are we meant to be prescriptive in relation to the zone of influence? Can you give some examples, perhaps in relation to your sketches?
What I was going to say, that first of all, most ecological surveys include a review of the biological records, which could be available from the local wildlife trusts and other organisations. And in that process, one is aware of what value is surrounding the site, because the reason this is important is that the ecologist can then identify what may be inside the site. For example, if there is a lot of bats adjacent to the site, it's very likely that they will be within the site itself as well. So that is the first thing to say. The second is that I think that it's good practice for both landscape architects and ecologists to make the client aware of what may be adjoining, and this may have an influence on many issues. Circulation, for example, is one. There may be footpaths that come in and go out. There may be roads coming in and going out, but also ecological corridors, etc. So that is the reason for looking slightly wider than the site itself and finding out what's abutting it.
Okay, great. I think that's that question answered. So it's great to see that we have got more questions coming through. So in terms of another question, just a quick one, will there be a section that covers protected species? So in BREEAM, we want to ensure we're going above and beyond what's required by regulation, and not mentioning it unless there's a need to have some form of prerequisite or emphasize it in some way. So I have to be honest, I can't remember off the top of my head whether we've made reference to protected species at all. But what I would say is because there is so much legislation governing it already, I would be surprised if we did make reference to protected species unless there was a specific reason for us to do so. So if you do think that we do need to make reference to protected species, then please let us know via the consultation, and that's something we'll take into consideration.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Yatunde was saying, that implicitly protected species are included as part of the sort of ecological appraisal of a particular site. But equally, you could say that protected species, where the process encourages thinking about protected species. And for instance, it's not unusual in urban sites for there to be a recommendation for example, black redstarts and black redstart boxes, where I think what we're trying to sort of change in a way is for that recommendation to be underpinned by the other needs that black redstarts have in terms of appropriate habitat for feeding, and other needs of bird species where we're recommending nest boxes. So it's not just a matter of recommending the nest box. We need to make sure that those species are catered for in ecological terms, not necessarily just within the site, but using the zone influence as well, making that work together and choosing the species that are sort of most appropriate for that combination of sort of ecological factors. And also to be thinking of the other benefits of attracting birds into the site, which in terms of residential development could be quite significant in terms of enhancing the quality of the habitat.
So other questions coming through. Another one which might be a quick one for me to answer. Has there been any consideration to incorporating the biodiversity net gain principles and stroke or biodiversity unit calculations as per the DEFRA offsetting metrics into the BREEAM assessments? What I would say to that question is yes, there has been consideration. The challenge has been for us getting a hold of the guidance that supports the biodiversity net gain principles. So we could look at the detail of that and look at where we should align, or where to even incorporate some of the content. What I would say also about that is the principles themselves. We would hope that when you go through the consultation document, you'll see that there is quite strong alignment there. But what we're always keen to do is align with industry guidance, metrics, etc. in general. So we're also looking at CIEEM documentation and also reviewing Landscape Institute documentation as well as others to ensure that we are aligning where we're relevant. In terms of the DEFRA metric, that's also a very good question. As part of this work, we are also reviewing BREEAM's change in ecological value calculation methodology, and looking at whether there is a need to evolve that in any way as well. Obviously, tools like the DEFRA metric, which are existing out there at the moment, are of interest to see what is out there right now that surrounds that. So, as I say, the answer is very much a yes, and we will see, we'll see where that takes us as part of this consultation. Okay, we've also had a question from Abby Bartlett. So we'll try and get through as many of these as possible, but it's great to see them now coming through. She hasn't read the consultation question yet, but there is, she's thinking that she's getting the feeling that there will be a requirement to involve the landscape architect early on, as well as the ecologist. So the concern there is that the problem with this is that at the early REBA stages, the client is typically very reluctant to pay out too much to consultants prior to achieving planning, which can make issues like this very hard to achieve. That's an excellent point, and I'll just respond from BRE's point of view first of all, and then Mark also wants to respond. So early on, I used the phrase practical application. I also mentioned that BREEAM is a voluntary scheme, and we want to promote ecology as much as possible. So it's more of a first thought rather than an afterthought. So issues of cost and value very much are in our minds, and also the practicalities of getting specialists involved early are also in our mind as well. In one of the first slides, I mentioned that BREEAM is outcomes focused, and we are very much across the board thinking more and more about that outcomes part of the methodology and what that means. Now, it may well mean moving forward in quite a lot of the BREEAM schemes, not just in ecology, but in other sections as well, that we're no longer going to be setting hard and fast rules right around about REBA stages requirements. Now, this is very much under consideration, and one of the current schemes out for consultation at the moment, actually, the BREEAM UK non-domestic new construction scheme, is a great example of what we are trialling in this area as part of the consultation process. So Abby, I very much take your point. It is feedback we get a lot, not just for ecology, but for other sections as well, about the point of involvement of specialists, what clients will be willing to pay for, what's viable and what's appropriate, etc. So we're just across the board, we're thinking very much about this outcomes focused way of delivering the criteria. So while I can't set your mind at rest, I'd also hope that it won't turn out to be the issue which you might feel it might be. But I would strongly suggest just keeping an eye on the consultation criteria, and then feeding back to us if you think there might be a problem arising there.
There's two issues here. Firstly, there's the issue of planning permission, and often planning authorities are very well aware of ecology and biodiversity and protected species. It could be that you're not being employed at an early stage because the client is not very well informed. The second issue could be that the landscape architect may also not be involved at an early stage. In terms of landscape architects, I think we are hoping that through the work we're doing together, that more landscape architects will be aware of the need to support ecologists at an early stage. So what I'm saying is that if a landscape architect is involved early, he should be advising his client that an ecologist should be employed at the same time.
I've got another quick one here, and then there's a question specifically for landscape and relating to landscape and ecology. So a question about the somebody commenting on the fact that we haven't released the draft scheme for the UK non-domestic new construction scheme, and asking when the ecology criteria will be released for comment. I want to make clear it is out right now. It is available for review and comment right now. It's at the website that was on the presentation, so www.bream.com/SCF. If you go there, you will be able to download the ecology criteria, which is within the consultation document. So that question for Max and Mark is, how much should we expect landscape architects to know and help ecologists, i.e. I still see many planting plans with Schedule 9 Conester species. Is this the information being spread within that industry?
I think my answer to that is that we as a group of landscape architects are hoping that more information will spread through our profession to encourage landscape architects to work more closely with ecologists, but also to be more aware of planting, not only plants that are produce counterproductive outcomes, but how we should be more careful of their use, because clearly there's an issue of planting that is undesirable. So my answer to your question is the two institutes are working quite closely together currently, hence me sitting here and Max, and we're hoping that through those institutes that a greater understanding will be spread.
So we're coming up to time shortly. We're not going to get through all of the questions, but we do have time for one more. So it's one from Rosie Wichiclo. Apologies if I didn't say your surname correctly, Rosie. But the question is, with the shift more to ecology and ecosystem services rather than biodiversity, does this mean there is more emphasis, so in brackets, recognised value for structure of habitat rather than just species stroke numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. I just heard Mark say across the other side of the table. Very much so. That's really what we're looking for. So yes, it will be great to have more species, more insects, for example, butterflies, what have you. But primarily, it is trying to ensure that the structure of the habitat, the functioning of that ecosystem, the ecology, is achieved to really to widen the gain. And as I said right at the outset, so that the input to a development, a change, infrastructure, etc., from an ecology point of view, actually becomes a real asset, and clients, developers see this as a real plus. So combining the biodiversity with the ecology function is a win-win all round.
Okay, great. We are up to time. I think it's 3 o'clock now by my clock, so we do have to end here. I was going to try and squeeze in one more question, which was about the experience and cooperation between the landscape architect and the ecologist, which somebody has asked, and that in that's this person's experience. When it comes to BREEAM schemes, the two specialists have different views and approaches, and it's difficult to find solutions. So I was going to let Mark and Max comment on that, but because we'll probably need to leave, what I'll do is I'll sign off now, and thank you all very much for listening. I very much enjoyed chairing this webinar in partnership with the Landscape Institute and also with CIEEM for BREEAM BRE. And I'll hand over to Mark and Max to finish on that note.
Of course. Yeah, I can understand your frustration that there are two different approaches. There are indeed two different approaches, but as a practitioner with both landscape architects and ecologists, I can reassure you, certainly as far as we're concerned, we always try and integrate the two skills. I think in the future this is going to happen more and more. BREEAM's being used more through the planning process, which encourages this integration. We as landscape architects often have a difficult job because we're trying to marry the two. Bear in mind that we have other issues to deal with, particularly with clients who see things differently. But the reason for this consultation is to move forward.
And just to add to that, it's been a very rewarding, refreshing working with the Landscape Institute, the landscape architects involved in this project. I'm sure we could all come up with other examples where it has worked extremely well. So I think that the runes are good, but it's something we need to work to, and I think something that we should be welcoming, that this BREEAM assessment in this particular case actually is strongly encouraging us to work in that direction and to understand each other better, so that overall we achieve a better outcome. So that's a good question, and one that we need to sort of work at into the future in order to make the most out of the benefits that come from the ecology within BREEAM. So we are left with a number of questions that sorry, I'm just reading a message here. Right, one last question, which is how near or far can a biodiversity action plan and other such things be included within the benefits of a site-specific assessment? I think there's considerable scope to be directed and take your recommendations from a biodiversity action plan or other initiatives within the local area. That's part of the reason for putting an emphasis on the local area, which could easily extend up to the county, for example. There's also much more scope for us to bring in local planning policies and guidance in our thinking and promoting the ideas to our clients, again from the local area, which are possibly covered by the questioners' sort of biodiversity action plans, etc. There are a number of push factors that are out there that we can use that are really of benefit. And again, the ecology part of BREEAM is encouraging us to do that. So again, thanks for that question. But there are a number of questions that remain to be answered. We obviously have those now and can take them away, and we'll sort of communicate to you what sort of platform we're able to answer them on, so that you can benefit from both the questions and hopefully the answers that have come up. Time to end the webinar. Thank you again very much for participating, particularly those of you who have asked questions. And just to underline again, you have till 6th of November to, is that the end of the 6th of November?
Yes.
Yeah, end of 6th of November, midnight, to have got your consultations in. This is important to us as ecologists, as landscape architects. So really encourage you to take this seriously. Put your thoughts in through the consultation process in order to make this an important, valuable step forward in terms of us as ecology practitioners.
Yes, I agree with that, and thank you for your participation.
Good stuff.
Thank you very much, everyone. And yeah, thank you to everyone for joining. We also welcome your feedback. So there'll be a feedback survey sent out to you shortly. And we look forward to seeing you at another CIEEM webinar very soon.